And for folks, I know there have been some questions of, are you going to record this? Yes, we are recording it. We've got Kat Dawson, who is our chat ambassador. So they are going to share a couple of links throughout today's conversation, but one that's really important that I want to make sure that you all get right now is if you do want to get the recording and you haven't yet subscribed to our newsletter, the Belonging Network newsletter, I'm going to put that in the chat window and we'll share it throughout. You'll see it at the end as well, so don't stress it if you don't see it now, but that's where you're going to be able to get the recording. So with that, we've got even more people coming in, so welcome. Today's webinar, you're in the right place if you came to learn more about building a gender-inclusive organization. It is also, as many of you know, the 3rd annual International Pronouns Day. So if that's new to you, don't worry, it's a relatively new holiday, and we celebrate it to respect sharing and educating others about our personal pronouns so that we do this as a daily practice. So if there's one thing that you take away about how to build a gender inclusive organization on a very personal level, try this, try sharing your pronouns. And one way that you can do it, and you can notice this in my own Zoom name, you'll see my name and then my pronouns. And I know some other folks also have that as well. So it's a great way in solidarity of sharing your pronouns so that we don't assume, but we're able to share them. And if other folks would like to share their pronouns as well, we create space for that. So for folks that are just coming in, we still have quite a few number of people joining right now, so welcome. We haven't yet quite got into the content, but what I am asking folks to do is to share their name and pronouns, where you're joining us from, and one thing that made you smile today. So thank you for doing that for those who have. All right, so first let's talk a little bit about tech as we get started. So we are using Zoom meetings. This is not a Zoom webinar. So we have full interaction. And the way that we're going to interact today is through the chat waterfall. So you're already seeing so many folks chiming in. So thank you for modeling on how to use the chat waterfall. This is going to be a great place for you all to share things that resonate. So if there's a point that's made, you can add it and say, wow, I didn't know that, or that's really helpful. If you have questions, this is going to be a place to add them. We're going to do our best in 60 minutes to try to get to, those questions that seem to be resonating or kind of a through line for other people as well. For those questions we don't get to, it's really important that you do subscribe to the newsletter because we'll respond to some of the frequently asked questions that do pop up during today's session. So, so again, as you're popping in, we still have a bunch of people joining us right now. Please go ahead and add your name, pronouns, and one thing that made you smile today. The other thing to note in terms of tech is that Kat Dawson is in the room with us, and they are our chat ambassador. So they're going to be kind of looking through the questions and being able to identify those that seem to be popping up and are pretty common for people. So, and we are recording, right? So that is the important thing. Okay, so you are here today because you wanted to learn about building gender inclusive organizations. So the purpose of the webinar is to clarify why building gender inclusive organizations is imperative to the future of work. So we'll talk a lot about what that means throughout this conversation. And we start here to help you make the case to your leadership team. So chances are, this might be a topic that you're passionate about for some. For others, this might be entirely new. And for other people, you might get this, but you might struggle with how to talk to your leadership team about why this should matter as it relates to your broader diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and commitments in your organization. So during our time, we're going to appreciate some of the things that every single person on the planet shares. I think that's really important, no matter our gender, right? We're also going to learn 3 reasons why the future of work is becoming increasingly non-binary. And we're going to walk away with just a few ideas on how your company can build a gender inclusive workplace. So a couple of things of what I want you to know. So this webinar is designed primarily for HR and diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders and professionals. So I really want to stress that. Though anyone who's participating right now will likely gain new insights, valuable knowledge that they can bring back into the workplace, and hopefully, share what you know as well. That's the power of our community, is that many of you all are doing this work as well. So, we would love that kind of dialogue, as much as we can dialogue through chat. This webinar is not a transgender or non-binary 101. So many of you all may have gone through 101s. We'll provide some basic framing so you know what we're talking about, who we're talking about. But again, this is not a 101. So that means that we're not going to necessarily be addressing personal actions or behaviors that we can take to be more inclusive as individuals. Rather, this is intended to look at system changes, the things that we as a team can do to transform our organization's culture. And the last thing that I want you to know is that this is really a sprint. It's a 60-minute sprint. So I'm going to be teaching you as much as I can, as much as I know. I'm going to be doing the best that I can do. But before concluding, I'm going to remind you about where to find some really valuable information, including a new software product that I've been developing with Diver Collective, which is a tech firm based out of New York that can help your company build gender inclusive organizations. So that is where we're going to go today. So a little bit about me. If you're not familiar with who I am or what I do, my name is Rhodes Perry. I use he, him, his pronouns. I founded my consulting firm about 5 years ago. It started in 2015. And I'm thrilled to invest the best waking hours of my day, having the opportunity to work with leaders, folks who are champions of belonging in the workplace, folks like you, to build psychological safety, trust building, and belonging as an outcome in the workplace. And I'm also the author of a best-selling book called Belonging at Work, which offers simple everyday strategies that anyone in the workplace can take to build a culture of belonging. And one line of the work that I get to focus in on pretty closely is helping organizations build gender inclusive organizations. So it's an area that I love. And I want to start out with sharing a little bit of a personal story about how I enter this work and why I do what I do. So, I worked at the White House right out of grad school, and I didn't feel safe. And I'm going to get to that in just a bit. But first, I want to share a little bit about what the job was. So, it was an incredible opportunity and one that required managing an $11 billion budget when I was all of 26. So clearly, I was really grateful for the opportunity, yet emotionally exhausted and disconnected from my team. And you might be wondering, what was the static? So when I would hang out at the water cooler, right, exchanges like this would occur. A colleague would ask me, hey, Rhodes, what sports did you play in high school? And, on the surface, as a question like that, what sports did you play in high school, is such a benign water cooler exchange, right? Yet responding to a question like that required a tightrope dance of mental gymnastics with just a sprinkle of historical censoring. So I'd stall, to try to respond to that question, and try to get the attention off of me. And it was hard. In my heart, I wanted to share that I played women's fast pitch softball for 16 years, and I was pretty good at it. But I didn't want to confuse my colleagues. So, in my head, I was thinking, maybe I could say I played baseball. That would be a safer response. But to me, I didn't want to lie, right? So I settled with just disclosing that I ran cross country. And it was a safe response. And it definitely did provide a pivot to get that attention off of me. But for some of you, you might be wondering why someone like me was playing women's fast pitch softball for so many years. So for those of you that don't know, I am a transgender guy. And while my colleagues got my name and my pronouns correct, even though I wasn't out, I felt unsafe and lacked a sense of trust to share more about who I am. So for those unfamiliar with transgender men, I was assigned female at birth and socialized as a girl and young woman in the world before transitioning. And my gender history offers definitely a powerful perspective in life and absolutely a powerful perspective in the workplace. But the water cooler exchange was a very tame example for more complicated self-censorship I had to do on a daily basis. So there were so many stories that I wanted to share to build trust and rapport with my colleagues. Yet in 2006, so that's when I was working at the White House, I was confident I was likely the first transgender person many on my team were likely to encounter. And I didn't want to serve at that time as an office educator, so I continued to censor my authentic self. And ultimately, I failed at that job. I failed to trust my colleagues, to share an important aspect of who I am. And another truth, the White House failed me in not offering a sense of safety, so namely job security. So at the time, there were no job protections for transgender workers. And this communicated to me that bringing my real self to work would come with great risks. I could even lose my job. So I hid. And while I'm probably not the first out transgender person many of you have encountered, um, I can guarantee that many other people in your life that you may or may not know who are trans or non-binary, you've encountered many of us. And today, what my goal is to connect my personal experiences at work with what I believe is a workplace epidemic of exclusion and othering, and how many of us in the workplace, many of us, I consider all of you leaders to be here to learn what we can do to make some changes, right? So first, what I would love to do, and I'm going to pull up a poll for you. I'm going to launch this right now. I would love for you to kind of consider if you've ever felt this lack of safety or trust on the job. So if you're not trans or non-binary, just try to imagine a time where you felt like you had to cover or conceal an important part of who you were, to say to your colleagues, yes, I matter. Yes, I measure up. Yes, I belong. So think about that. And if you're nodding of like, yes, Rhodes, I've definitely experienced this before. As you're responding to this poll, which should be up on your screens right now, so if you can please respond to that. I would ask you to consider, what important parts of yourself did you have to cover or even leave behind? So it looks like maybe the poll is not popping up here. Okay. All right. So the poll is not happening, but I would love to hear from folks, and I'm seeing that there. Okay. So I'm seeing a lot of yeses. Thank you. You all have my back. I love that. Yeah. So I'm seeing that there's that common response of yes. I'm seeing some words of frustration. Yeah. Try to name that feeling if you've been there before, just in one word. And I'm seeing it feels scary and painful, isolation, shame, being different, gross, invisible, covered, stigmatized, self-betrayal. Yeah, these are gross feelings, right? They're not good feelings to have. And think about not only the cost to you as an individual, but the cost to your organization. If you're feeling that at work, in terms of your productivity, in terms of showing up as your real self and feeling that you are embraced for who you are, that's often not present, right? Because there's a part of your brain negotiating, again, that self-censorship, like in the story I shared. If you're not familiar with this kind of hiding in the workplace, it's known as covering. And Kenji Yoshino is a scholar out of NYU Law School and writes a lot about this very powerfully. It's covering is protective. We cover what's most precious to us, what we're afraid will get hurt on the job in order to get ahead, right? And tragically, we think that by doing the covering that we will belong in the workplace. But this is not an authentic feeling of belonging. It further exacerbates the feelings of being unsafe and lacking trust. Some of the items that you're sharing here in the chat window right now. So let's put a pin in that feeling, because we're going to circle back to that in the conversation we talk about today, and move into a few things on this webinar that I really want to focus in on of what we share. So I'm going to get rid of this poll because it didn't work for you all. My apologies. Okay, so no matter who you are, if you're transgender and non-binary, or if you don't identify that way, we all share some key demographics when it relates to gender. And there's three key things that we share. The first is that we share a biological sex, or a sex assigned at birth, which is based on the body. So our genitals, our chromosomes, gonads, hormones, etc. So most of us are assigned male or female at birth, though intersex condition occurs in 1 in every 1,000 births. So our sex assigned at birth is often included on identity documents. Most that we're familiar with are our birth certificates, right? The second thing that we share is a gender identity. And this is our innermost sense of being male, being female, or another gender altogether. So this may or may not align with our assigned sex at birth. So where assigned sex aligns with our gender identity, we use the term cisgender. Cis is a Latin term which basically means on the same side. Where our assigned sex does not align with our gender identity, we use the umbrella term transgender. And trans is Latin for meaning across. Now, important to note, non-binary is a spectrum of gender identities that are outside of the gender binary. So non-binary identities can fall under the transgender umbrella because many non-binary people identify as a gender that is different than their assigned sex at birth. The third piece that we all share is how we express our gender. So this gives clues about our gender to society, which may include our clothing, our body language, our hairstyles, voice inflection, mannerisms, behaviors, and interests. So when it comes to gender expression, this is important. It's important to refrain from assuming another's gender just by looking at them. So it will take a conversation and learning someone's name and pronouns before we can respectfully affirm who that person is. So that's really, really important. And one piece that I also want to share that is not related to gender, though it sometimes gets conflated with it, is sexual orientation. So sexual orientation refers to our emotional, psychological, physical, and sexual attraction to other people of the same, different, or no gender at all. So what's important to note here is that regardless of our gender, being cisgender, transgender, non-binary, we all have a sexual orientation, and that is different from our gender. So if you get that, that is a win for this webinar, okay? So again, these are aspects of our identities that we all share, which are similar to other demographic categories, such as our age, our race, our ability, our national origin, etc. So while every person on the planet shares these aspects of human identity, if you were to describe your relationship to them, and I describe my relationship to them, chances are they would be very different. And that's what allows us to stand out as our real selves, as who we are, okay? So gender identity and gender expression are just two aspects of multiple and intersecting identities. So as a person, we have different demographic adjectives that describe us. So when we examine power, okay, and how power works in our culture, it's important to note that we can hold both privileges and oppression in complicated ways based on our identities. So looking at this wheel of power, I know there's a lot of stuff going on in this. I find this to be really helpful to look at. Kind of take a moment and just really absorb what's being featured here. And on the outside, you'll see things like gender, citizenship, skin color, education, etc. You know, think about yourself and where you can locate where you have power and where you may not have power. I really love this wheel. You can see at the bottom, the artist who created it was not me, but I find it to be a very helpful educational tool. So the closer you are to the center, that showcases where you hold privilege, and the further out where you are in the center, that showcases where you don't. So understanding where we hold power and where we experience oppression across those multiple and intersecting identities helps us better understand our relationship to our health, our well-being, our economic outcomes. So when it comes to the workplace, I want us to examine the workplace experiences specific for transgender and non-binary folks. And then we'll discuss a little bit about why the workplace is becoming increasingly non-binary. So let's go and let's just become a little bit more familiar with trans and non-binary people in the United States. So the Williams Institute, and I know some folks might be more familiar with the Williams Institute than others. It's a think tank based out of UCLA, they do a lot of demographic work around LGBTQ plus communities. And so they conservatively estimate that there are about 1.4 million transgender adults living in the United States right now. When you break it down by generation, some of the demographics that they share is that 12% of US millennials identify as transgender or non-binary, with the majority of younger generations believing that gender is on a spectrum, right? So while there are a smaller segment of national population data, there are some alarming statistics to transgender and non-binary people's economic outcomes and well-being. So I want to share a couple of findings from a 2015 study that was done by the National Center for Transgender Equality. And again, like I said at the beginning of this webinar, these might be talking points you might be familiar with, but think about sharing them with your colleagues and folks on your leadership team in particular about why this matters in particular to the workplace. So a couple things to take note of. For the people that responded to the survey, and I believe it was over 60,000 transgender and non-binary folks in 2015 that responded across the country. The survey found that 30% of transgender and non-binary folks, or 29%, sorry, live in poverty, which is more at the time than double the national average, which at the time was 14%. Another stat that really kind of blows me away is that 12% of transgender and non-binary folks are unemployed, and that was also more than double the national average in 2015 when the survey was done. Another piece to look at is that transgender and non-binary adults are 4 times more likely than the general population to earn less than $10,000 a year. And the last stat that I want to share, of the trans and non-binary folks who are working in that they were employed, 77% took steps to avoid mistreatment in the workplace, such as hiding, like the story that I shared about my own personal workplace experience, or even delaying their gender transition. So showing up to the workplace as the gender that they are because they were afraid of being mistreated on the job, which includes discrimination, microaggressions, being overlooked for promotions, those opportunities to grow in your role. So this is very alarming, right? And what I'd like to say on this is that tragically, these experiences are not unique. So while this is looking at the experiences of trans and non-binary people in the United States, globally, these numbers are pretty comparable. So I also want to go back to thinking about intersectionality. And in this case, intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. So oppressions are not isolated, which is why it's important for us to talk about intersectionality in this context. So let's take a look again at the US Trans Survey on racial demographics alone. So the findings make it clear that folks who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander who are also transgender experience an even higher rate of poverty, and underemployment, along with mistreatment on the job, due both to transphobia and racism. So this is compounded, right? This is what we mean by intersectionality in this context. So it highlights how oppressions are not isolated. So one of the things that I would encourage you all to do, in particular, if you're working really closely with folks who are doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, when you're thinking about building gender inclusive organizations, it's important that we embrace this concept of targeted universalism. So Dr. John Powell works out of UCLA Berkeley, I believe. He came up with targeted universalism. So this simply means that we have a universal goal that we want to have a gender inclusive organization for everyone, right? And it's important that for us to achieve that, we center our efforts around those who are most vulnerable. So for example, a Black neurodiverse transgender woman, that might be a vulnerable person in your workplace, right? So when we're successful at embracing targeted universalism, this particular woman has a chance to thrive in your organization, which means that your organization is likely to thrive when it comes to the future of work, of building a greater sense of safety, trust, and belonging for all, right? So this is a really, really important point that I really want to underscore. So if targeted universalism is a newer concept, please continue after today's webinar to learn more about John Powell's work, because I think it's very helpful when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So let's move into why the workplace is becoming increasingly non-binary. So 2 years ago, so 2018, the Pew Research Center surveyed 10,000 people to get a better understanding of the generations and their relationship to non-binary people. So again, these are folks who identify, non-binary people are folks who identify as a gender beyond male or female. What they found in their research was illuminating, and it should put business leaders in particular on notice. So the survey revealed that it's Generation Z. So if you're not familiar with the generations, folks who are born between 1996 and 2004, that really stand out on this matter. So on most subjects asked about gender inclusivity, the younger generations had similar views. So the first that I'd love to share here is that the first reason why the future of work is becoming increasingly non-binary is that more and more people know or work with someone who uses a gender neutral pronoun. So they or them, Z or here, Z or Zer. There's a number of different gender neutral pronouns that you may have heard. There's actually a lot of them. I think some of the more common ones are they and them or Z and here, right? So, and of all the generations featured on this slide, we can see that Gen Z, 35% of all Gen Zers knew, or at the time knew of someone using gender neutral pronouns. But not too far behind when you look at millennials, 25%, Gen X, I mean, even going down to the silent generation, those folks that are still in the workplace right now, 7% know someone who uses they or them, a gender neutral pronoun, okay? So the second reason why the workplace is becoming increasingly non-binary, when it comes to accepting, how accepting society is in general of people who don't identify as exclusively a man or exclusively a woman. The views of Gen Zers and millennials differ from those older generations. So roughly half of Gen Zers you see up on the slide here, I know there's a lot going on there, but about 50% of Gen Zers and 47% of millennials think that society is not accepting enough. And that translates to the workplace. So when you're thinking about, we want to recruit the best and brightest, we're bringing in younger people, there are different expectations of what these young people would like to see in the workplace. They want to see workplaces that are more gender inclusive. And we'll talk about what that means, don't worry. But this is something that I think is really helpful for both you to prepare, but also for your leadership teams to prepare to understand this change and the change in relationship to how we see and view gender as being more on a spectrum, right? So, and even here, you can see on the slide, there's smaller shares of Gen Xers, boomers, and the silent generations that say the same. So the third reason that I want to talk about, and I think this is huge. So just kind of take this stat in for a second. The last reason why the workplace is becoming increasingly non-binary, globally, 25% of Gen Zers expect to change their gender identity at least one time during their lifetime. So if you're doing the math, there's about 88 million Gen Zers out there right now. That's 1/4 of all Gen Zers, so 22 million younger people right now, and some of whom are already in the workplace. So these are 22 million young people entering the workplace. They're wanting to work at exceptional employers that have done the work, that have created a sense of safety where they can show up and be their real selves and do their best work. So right now, this begs the question for all of us, how is your organization preparing for the future of work, which is clearly, from this stat alone, becoming increasingly more and more non-binary. So just kind of sit with that question for a moment. I know you're here because you want to know how to prepare, so we're going to get there, but just kind of sit with those feelings. So how do we prepare? How do we build a gender inclusive organization? Before we run out to try to hire the best and brightest transgender and non-binary employees to help us, we have to recognize that our workplace cultures may not have caught up with existing workplace policies and employment laws that ban discrimination against transgender and non-binary people. So I can say for sure, I live in Portland, Oregon. We have we enjoy a lot of laws and policies that on paper protect transgender and non-binary people. And I can tell you that there's a lot of workplace cultures that are trying, but have not got their cultures caught up to the spirit of these laws, right? So that's important to take in. So the floor really is banning discrimination, right? Like we don't want discrimination in our workplace. We don't want microaggressions in our workplace, but what more can we do? So we have to look beyond prohibiting mistreatment of transgender and non-binary people to shift workplace cultures. So to build safer workplaces, ones where trans and non-binary people are encouraged to show up as our real selves, we want to acknowledge, what it will take to build a better workplace for all. Okay, so there's some bad news here, and this is something that pops up when I work with some clients. They want a silver bullet approach. They want that one training. We're going to train all of our staff one time, and then we're going to magically change our culture. I have to say, it doesn't work that way. Training is important, and I think robust, ongoing training is a really important step, but it's only one of what I frame as 7 core benchmarks. So what you're seeing here on the slide is a way that I approach this work. So when I think of how to transform culture, this I would say is the kind of the gold standard of thinking, okay, gender touches almost all parts of our organization. So how do we look at our organization with a new set of lens? Like we're putting on new glasses. And this framework is something that I find incredibly helpful. And right here, you're seeing those 7 core benchmarks. So I can read through them, and I'm going to talk more about them, throughout this webinar. But the first piece is thinking about employee policies, procedures, right? So things like non-discrimination laws, that we know, at least from the recent Supreme Court ruling, Boxstaff versus Clayton County. This was a ruling that looked at Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, federal law, and looked at sex protections and included both sexual orientation and gender identity as a part of that. So that impacts all of us. That impacts all of our workplaces. A first question for you all, when you think about your workplace, have you looked at your own non-discrimination policies and updated those, right? So that's a first step when you think about a simple, again, the floor. Like, has our organization stated that we welcome transgender and non-binary people and we're in compliance with the law? So floor is complying, right? There's plenty of other policies you can look at, which we'll talk about in a bit, that you can take that a step further. The second piece is workforce development, right? So I did mention training. It's not the panacea, it's not the silver bullet, though it's an important strategy to raise awareness, to help us connect with what we share with transgender and non-binary people, and also appreciate some of the barriers that for us trans and non-binary people, what we experience in the workplace. So those kind of 101 trainings, 201 trainings, we'll talk about that in a bit. That's another important component. When you're thinking about culture and design, so for workplaces, and I know many of us are now stuck in a virtual working from home space, but if you think about serving communities or you have a physical location, when you walk into that location, would it be clear to someone who's transgender or non-binary to see, oh, wow, I'm welcomed here? Something as simple as a transgender flag could be like a first start. Things like all user restrooms could be a second start. Artwork, music by transgender and non-binary musicians could be another step. There's many different ways to look at that. But right now, if you were to assess your organization, would that be a physical space? Could you think of a physical space that communicates that? And if not, it's not that hard to make those changes, right? A third piece is guidelines, so thinking about how you coach staff, right? So if you do have policies, how do you make that aware beyond just a training, for specific jobs and roles like managers and supervisors, making sure that they understand how to be set up for success to support a transgender or non-binary person. The last 3 is looking at systems and design. So thinking about employee forms. One of the stats I didn't share with you is that for Gen Zers, almost 60% expect when they're filling out anything from an employee engagement survey to information about themselves, they want to make sure that there are gender inclusive boxes to fill out that are beyond the binary, beyond male or female options. And that's, that's something that also can be changed. So if it's something that's on paper, that process will look different as if you're working with your IT team to update, actual electronic systems, right? The last two pieces are really, really important: sustainability and capacity building. So has your organization dedicated resources? Do you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion office? If you do, awesome. And I'm sure those leaders in that office are thinking about globally how to build a more welcoming organization, an organization where belonging is an outcome for those least likely to feel safe. So in that work, is there a component around gender inclusion? Do you have experts inside your organization, or do you have resources to bring in experts from the outside to help you? So that's really key, because just to say we're inclusive is not doing the work, right? You want to have both words and actions sometimes require resources. The last piece that I would say that's really, really important here is thinking about your leadership team. So are they engaged? Do they understand even some of the stats that we've shared earlier about the generations and the future of talent coming into your organization? And if they don't, this is an opportunity to start those conversations, right? So these are the benchmarks, but I want to take this a step further, which is helping to categorize where your organization is at. So those 7 benchmarks, you look at them, it's like 7 things, okay, we can check them all off. I can guarantee like each one of those benchmarks, there's many, many other steps within them of how you can start as doing the foundational work, where you can take it to build a more solid foundation, or where you can truly be an innovative organization that is aligning with what the future of work will be, which is increasingly non-binary. So, so just to kind of look at this, and I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I do want to go through each of these levels to a certain degree so you can become a little more familiar. So if you are listening to this webinar and you're like, oh my gosh, we haven't even updated our non-discrimination policy, okay? You might be in that we're just getting started, and that's okay. That's totally okay. That's why you're here on this webinar, is to learn a little bit more. I would encourage you to take a look at this first tier of how we kind of categorize organizations. So, and we look at 5 different levels, 5 different basic things that you can be doing right now if you're not doing them. So the first, like I said, are you engaged with your leadership team? Are they aware of how younger generations are now viewing gender as being more on a spectrum? That's the first step. If you haven't done that, I would encourage you after today, you get the recording of today's conversation, share it with those folks that you think ought to be more familiar with what's coming, in terms of talent. The second piece, like I said, laws have changed. Federal law has changed. So have you updated your non-discrimination policy? And in that, do you have some basic policies around how we share pronouns, or how we protect the privacy of those folks on our team who may have transitioned in the workplace, or may have transitioned before working in the organization, but may not want their gender history shared for whatever reason? So these are some of the basic things to think through at that foundational level. Additionally, we talk about setting managers and supervisors up for success. So for guidance, what kind of coaching are you offering around managing a gender transition in the organization? So if you did hire a trans or non-binary person, or someone is trans or non-binary right now and has come forward to a manager to say, hey, I'm not really sure how to approach this, but I'd like to transition in the workplace and I need your support. So have you developed a basic, protocol of how to do that? And are your managers and supervisors ready to do that? And that might feel more advanced, right? But it's still at that foundational level to create a safer environment before you do a massive campaign and try to hire as many trans and non-binary people as possible, right? Workforce development. So we talked a little bit about that. Basic training. So raising awareness for all. What I'd like to say is that it is important to do a pretty massive training for all staff to understand what it takes just to be respectful of someone who's trans or non-binary, or anyone, asking someone their name, asking them their pronouns if they feel comfortable sharing, and moving forward, just so that we can respect, who's standing before us. Because honestly, there is nothing sweeter than the sound of your own name and your own pronoun being properly used, right? That's a sign of respect. So, so that's a basic training, because it takes all of us to create a welcoming organization and only one of us to create a hostile environment that can ruin it for everybody, right? So that's the basic level of training. And then the last piece is we talked about that design, looking at, I'm walking into a physical space. Do I see that I'm welcomed here? Something as simple, again, like a transgender flag, or, seeing artwork from a famous transgender person, right? So that's the foundation. So if you've not done those things, that's where you start. If you are one of the organizations that is like, check, 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 we have done all that, we are on top of it, I'd encourage you to take it a step further and look at the solid level. So this is where you've done more than talk with your leadership team. The leadership team is engaged. So they have said, Rhodes Perry, who's on our C-suite team, Rhodes is going to be the chief executive sponsor. Part of his performance, part of his bonus is related to advancing our DEI commitments, and this is a part of it, right? That's a big step, right? But you need that level of support. So if that feels out of reach, don't sweat it. We talked about the foundational stuff. If you've already done that, maybe look at more of what's in this intermediate tier level, which is looking at your healthcare plans. Have those healthcare plans included, making sure that transgender and non-binary people, like everybody else, are able to access the benefits that are guaranteed to them. So if you've not done those negotiations with different healthcare insurers that you have plans with, that's an important step to take. And it may take some time, but it is well worth it. It's really, really important. Workforce development 201. So beyond training everyone, managers and supervisors, do they understand, how to support a trans or non-binary employee, beyond just transitioning in the job, but definitely managing a gender transition, starting there. Access to gender inclusive facilities. So thinking about all user restrooms. So if you have like a single occupancy restroom, right, where it's just a door, a lock, and a toilet and a sink, have you been able to convert that just to say restroom or all user restroom? That's something that's basic and simple, though it does take an effort to work, especially if you're in a multinational corporation. There's a lot of different sites, a lot of different buildings. So how do you make those conversions? And how do you make sure that for multi-stall restrooms, that you are able to make sure that people get to determine where they feel safest in the restroom, and that is inclusive of transgender and non-binary people, right? So that requires some education with leaders. There's fortunately a lot of best practices out there. So again, that's where you can take it further. Thinking about inclusive services, service delivery, and marketing. So if you're an organization that delivers services to communities, are you providing culturally specific services to transgender and non-binary people? If you're a company like Nike and you're selling shoes and clothing, have you worked and have you consulted with transgender and non-binary people around designing unisex shoes or a clothing line, right? Which is not just good for trans and non-binary people, it's good for everyone to have more options, right? And then the last piece is just guidance, right? So beyond equipping managers and supervisors, if you're someone who's an employee and wants to have more success in interfacing with trans and non-binary people, has your company designed any kind of guidance of how to set your staff up for success? So that's the intermediate level. If you've checked all of those off, we can go into the innovative level for sure. And if that's you, please email me, because I'd love to talk with you about what you're doing, and how to really build a gender inclusive organization. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of going beyond those 7 benchmarks, how to think about where your organization is at. So you might be a little overwhelmed, because that's a lot. That's a lot of different, yes, I'm seeing heads shaking. So don't sweat it, okay? So if you're concerned with determining where your organization is at, we've got your back, okay? So over the past year, I mentioned our chat ambassador, Kat Dawson. So their company is called Diver Collective. They're a tech company based out of New York. And we put our heads together to say, how do we figure out how to assess organizations? And we developed a best-in-class software product that's designed to fully support organizations that are ready to say, yes, we are ready to do this work, but we have no idea where we are. So we developed a product called Hire, and it helps organizations take control over becoming more gender inclusive in terms of all aspects of culture, right? So incorporating those 7 benchmarks of gender inclusion and determining where exactly your company sits. Are you at that beginning level, tier 1? Are you at that intermediate level? Or are you truly like doing some innovative work and you want to take it further? So basically the product leverages about 20 years of expertise that automates some of the most time consuming parts of assessing where your organization is at. So the cool thing is that we've got a free assessment for you alone just to fill out yourself. When we work with companies, on a much bigger scale, we could have, if we worked with Hilton, for example, 160,000, all of their employees, if they wanted to take the assessment and aggregate towards the average of really where both what is in reality in place, but also perception of employees, what might be in place to have a gender inclusive organization. So if you are interested in that, I encourage you to, one, subscribe to the newsletter, because after today, we're going to give a recording of the talk to everyone. And we also will share how to take that assessment. And that's the best way just to kind of know, throwing a stake in the sand of like, okay, good. We have some of these items in place at that foundational level, but we haven't quite got to tier 2 yet. And what is needed to get there? So it's just meant to kind of create some order in what otherwise might feel like, oh my gosh, we're just getting started and there's so much to do, right? So we're taking some of that overwhelm out of it. So what I would say is one of the best features about what Hire offers is that for participating companies that we work with, we feature a supplemental app for job seekers. And this is particularly for transgender and non-binary job seekers. So employers that are committed to building gender inclusive organizations have access to hundreds of trans and non-binary talent, right? And the reason why like I'm in particular thrilled about this feature is that for the first time, transgender, non-binary people, folks like me will have a much better sense of what specific commitments different organizations are taking, those different actions of building a more gender inclusive environment. So what I could say is in the old days, for many of us trans non-binary people, it would often be word of mouth of like, well, I think Rhodes' company is pretty trans inclusive. We know one trans person that works there. So you can apply, but we're not totally sure what they're doing to make it a fully safe environment. This takes the guesswork out of it. And it really, puts the power in the hands of job applicants to say, wow, all of these companies are at some place, making a commitment to doing this work. So at least I'm more informed to know that conversations have already happened about my safety so that I can just do my best work, right? So what I love it so much. But I do want to share a few things about the strengths of trans and non-binary talent. We talked about some of the barriers, some of the economic challenges that many in our communities experience. I want to spend some time about why your organization will be better off, when you're building a safer environment, right? Like that's the first step. But as you do that, why you can benefit from having trans and non-binary talent on the team. So the first piece is that for many of us trans folks, we have a strong sense of self-awareness. And the reason why is we have to often explain our identities to groups of people who don't understand, question, or tell us that we aren't who we are, right? So we're very rooted in who we are, and self-awareness is a key leadership skill that allows trans candidates to stand out. It's a key leadership skill that we all need to be confident in the work that we do every day. The second piece that I'd love to share is that for those of us who are trans and non-binary, we tend, and it's a generalization, but there is an inclination of embracing differences because many of us understand what it feels like to feel different, to feel excluded, to endure discrimination and microaggressions. So reaching across differences and understanding similar experiences for other folks who may experience discrimination, microaggressions for different reasons, there is that ability to embrace difference and have a stronger set of empathy muscles because of our own lived experiences. Another reason is that we tend to be pretty resilient and resourceful. So studies time and time again show that trans folks often demonstrate very high rates of resilience and resourcefulness. that allow us to cope with everyday stress, right? So, like I said, that kind of word of mouth network of, where can we apply for jobs in order to be treated with respect, or where can we get healthcare that will allow us to get the healthcare we need to be happy and healthy, right? So that's a really good strength. And the last time I checked when I was hiring, resilient and resourceful, I want that in my employees, right? So that's another really strong trait. Another piece that isn't featured up on the slide that I just want to share is just this sense of fostering optimism. So many of us, like on this call, whether we're trans, non-binary or not, we want to lead happy and hopeful lives. And for us, by doing that, by doing our best work, we offer possibility models, not only for other younger trans and non-binary people, but for folks in the workplace in general, going back to those feelings of hiding important aspects of who we are, living in our authenticity, showing up as our real selves, that's powerful, and then inspires other people to show up as their authentic selves and to be just as hopeful about the future. So those are some of the things that I see in the research that I love to share with you. Again, when you're thinking, okay, we're doing all this work in building gender inclusive organizations, how can we communicate why this is a value add to our leadership team? So I leave that with you all. And I want to try the poll again, but I'm afraid it might not work. So just bear with me for a second. But I do have a final poll question for you. So let's see if I can do some magic here. So let's see if this is going to work for y'all. Okay. So let's see. So I launched this poll. I'm going to look in the chat window. Do y'all see the poll? A simple yes. Okay, cool. All right. So to me, a lot of this was informational today. We went, like I said, at a sprint. So I would love to know, after today, you can choose one action, you could choose a ton, but I just want to get a sense of, what's one thing that feels within reach after we close out today's conversation. So I'm looking at, people are taking the time to respond, and thank you for doing that. So the options are, and I'll just read them out loud, that you'll subscribe to the blogging newsletter so you get the recording and you can take that free assessment. You're going to take the higher assessment, so that's cool. You're going to share today's recording with someone else on your team who might benefit from what we talked about. Self-education, learning a little bit more. Maybe it's about targeted universalism. Maybe it's about the next generation of non-binary talent coming in. You also have the opportunity to visit Hire's website, so we'll share that information with you. You can share something else in the chat waterfall, so I'm going to look at that in a second. And one act of solidarity, right, is, maybe not right now because we're almost ending our webinar, but the next time you go on Zoom, or maybe it's LinkedIn, wherever you are, when you look at your name, you can also add in your name your pronouns. You can put in parentheses, like for me, he and him, or they and theirs, or she and her. Whatever pronouns you use, you can add that. And I can say, as a trans person, when I see that, I'm like, yes, okay, like this person has definitely sat through a webinar like this, and I can be a little bit more of myself with who they are. So it's a great act of solidarity. So if that feels like within reach, I would encourage you to consider doing that. Oh, cool. So Danny added a pro tip about LinkedIn. You can add kind of quotations in LinkedIn's mobile app to do that. So thank you. Yeah, this is awesome. So I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat. I saw a number of questions that were popping up as well. So let's see how we're doing on time. So we've got about 7 minutes. So I'm going to leave you with these items in just a minute, but what I would love to do is just end this slideshow for a second, stop the screen share, and look at all of your amazing faces, because we are in like the virtual world of webinars and everything else. Wow. Okay. These are a lot of people. So I really thank you for being here and having this conversation. What I'm going to do is go over to the chat window and see if there are, and let me see if I can unmute Kat here. Okay, so Kat, you are unmuted. I know you've been watching the chat waterfall. Was there like a couple of questions that you think are worth kind of revisiting or talking about in these last few minutes together?
Oh, well, I think there are tons of great things to pick from. Um, but there's been so much wonderful activity on the chat. It's sort of hard to find the right one. I want to, I think one thing to note is a lot of people were talking about creating all gender restrooms in their workplaces, and spoke to, and I'm seeing people nodding here, spoke to the complexity of initiating that kind of initiative. And I'm wondering if you could speak maybe to folks who might want to be a voice in that direction in their workplace,
Yes.
how they can put themselves forward or put that idea forward in ways that are productive and safe for them.
Yes, thank you. So yes, so a couple of options. I want to give you options because I know that there is the ideal that we aspire to, and then there's the doing what you can to try to create a slightly safer organization. So one, I think one of the kind of easier steps to take, although it takes conversation. So if this is still a challenge, I've been there, trust me. But thinking about those single occupancy restrooms like I shared. So a bathroom with a door, there's one toilet, one sink, you're in it, there's only one person using it at a time. There's plenty of examples online. All user restrooms is kind of the term that I would encourage you to look at. That is where I would suggest starting and seeing if you can convert over those single occupancy restrooms with, prioritizing, we want to make sure that these are only used for folks who need them, right? So if someone needs it for accessibility issues, if there's someone who needs a lactation room, right? If there is, a parent with a younger child of a different gender who needs to, assist that child, because they're a toddler, right? Like we're making space for those folks as well as for trans and non-binary people. So if you don't fall in those categories, it's really important, and that's where kind of training and coaching comes in, to make sure that your staff understand, if you're a cisgender, able-bodied person and you can use whatever restroom throughout whatever part of the building, try to be mindful and leave that space open. That's the first step, I would say. The second step is doing education around multi-stall restrooms. I've seen some organizations that kind of state very simply, this restroom is for men and people who know that they belong in the men's restroom. There's lots of iterations on that. Don't quote me on that. I have better language. So if you need something like that, I can give you plenty of examples of other organizations. That's a second step. The third step, I would say, is when you are, you're using commercial real estate, and your lease is up, or you buy a new building, as you're doing the construction of that is an incredible opportunity to both build in single occupancy restrooms, on each floor. You can make that a policy, and I've seen organizations do that. Even with multi-stall restrooms, and this might be a step further for some organizations, though in Europe, if you've ever been to a train station in Europe, you'll see that there's many, many sinks, and there's lots of single occupancy restrooms all in one location with a giant door that locks, right? So it's a multi-stall restroom, but it's a series of single occupancy restrooms, if that makes sense. So this is more modern building design. So if you talk with some of the national building, architect firms, this is where it's trending. So again, for those innovative organizations. So again, if you were like, oh, we are tier 3 all the way, if you haven't done this, that's where you can take it a step further. And it does require some education. So there's a resource I'll share after today's conversation. It's called Stalled, and it's an architecture firm out of New York that specializes in this conversation in particular. And it's building restrooms, obviously not just for trans, non-binary people, but for people who need some kind of accommodation to go about the rest of their day at work, right? So that's a resource I'll share after, and it's a great question. So thanks for listening to me. And again, just kind of remember, like, do what you can where you're at. Don't punish yourself because you're not quite at that innovative level. If you can only convert single occupancy restrooms right now, then that's where you start, but it's not where you end, right? You still want to keep those conversations going. So, all right, I'm seeing some people having to jump off. We still have like 1 minute left. So if anyone wants to stick around, maybe Kat, I can answer one more question for folks.
Rhodes, I think because we're coming to the end, I know that people have to jump off. I want to thank everybody for attending today. Rhodes, one thing that's come up regularly is how people can get a hold of this assessment to take it. Can you just share a little bit about how we'll be sharing that?
Yes, great question. So I put back up, I had to So I only see some of your faces now, but so this is what we've got here. So on the screen, again, the best way if you want the recording from today's conversation, if you want to take the assessment, just visit rhodesperry.com/subscribe. And I think, Kat, if you could put that in the chat window, that is going to be, it probably will pop up fast, but that's where you can find it. Also, another resource that I would love to share with you is we have a Belonging at Work community, and it's largely with HR and diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals. So there's also a link, and if Kat, you can share that link as well. It's featured up on the screen. If you're looking for support, not just with building a gender inclusive organization, but you're trying to think about going back to John Powell's work, how do we take that targeted universal approach where we want everyone in our organization to feel a strong sense of belonging, and we want to center those efforts around those least likely to feel safe. This is a really fantastic community that's coming together. The next time we meet is on Monday, and we're talking about the White House's executive order, which is banning diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, specifically around talking about systemic racism and white supremacy in the workplace. So if that's like a topic that you're looking for support on, those are just like, that's just a flavor of some of the things we talk about. And absolutely, talking about building gender inclusion in the workplace is something that we specialize in. So if that's of interest, that's available to you. But again, for the recording of today's conversation and taking the higher assessment, the best way to do that is to subscribe. And I know many of you already are subscribing and some of you aren't. So if you did not receive an email from me an hour before today's conversation, then that's an indicator you haven't subscribed to the newsletter and you won't get the recording. So again, if you want that, please take that action. So with that, our time is over. I just want to like review again, because I know some folks have joined at different parts of the conversation. So where we went today, we learned 3 things that we all share when it comes to gender. So hopefully that was helpful. We learned 3 reasons why the workplace is becoming increasingly non-binary. And hopefully you're walking away with just a few ways of thinking a little bit differently about how to build a gender inclusive organization. So I thank you. This work is near and dear to my heart. And the fact that you are so generous and spending, a full hour of your attention with me is not going unnoticed. I very much appreciate that. And so if there's any ways that for Kat or myself to support you all in this work, you know where to find me. Again, if you just subscribe to the newsletter, it's probably the best way. You'll get my email, and I'm very happy to respond to your questions. So I will go through the chat archive of everyone's questions and see, where those frequently asked questions are and get back to you in a follow-up note. So another incentive to subscribe to the newsletter. And that's all that I have for you today. So again, thank you so much. Keep up the great work. I know it's not easy, especially during these times, but the good news is we have each other, and that's super powerful. So have a great day, and thanks again for sharing, one thing that made you smile today. That definitely made my day. So have a good one. Thank you. Bye.